Morning, winemaker Tim here. Warning, contains sulfites. All right, I want to take you through a few different directions on this. First off, I want to talk about why sulfite's important, talk about its history. We're going to talk about why we use it in wine. And then we're going to talk about some of the reasons some of the misinformation about it flows around. So number one, let's talk about the history. First off, we've been using sulfites in wine for probably around 3,000 years. We've been using it to preserve foodstuffs. We know this from things we found in Egypt, but we've definitely been using it in wine part and parcel. We've got pretty good written records going back 400 or 500 years, maybe even 600. I think the original writing about it was in Kellermeistery, and they talked about taking brimstone, sulfur, mixing with wood chips and burning it and then pouring the wine quickly in afterwards. Turns out when you do that, you get about a 50 part per million sulfur add, which is a really common number that we still use in the wine industry. And so let's point out the brimstone is something that's organic, it's natural, it exists, and sulfur's around, and it's a super, super useful tool. So that's step one. And so we've been using it for a long time. Now, why do we use it in wine? Well, it does two things primarily. Number one, it prevents oxidation, and it prevents oxidation in a couple different ways. It prevents it in the juice of the wine. So if we're pressing juice, when we're pressing that juice, that sulfur, what it does is it prevents a compound called polyphenol oxidase. And that compound is an enzyme because it ends in A's. Anything time something ends in A's, it's an enzyme. So it prevents polyphenols, the things in wine, from turning brown and oxidizing. And this also works really, really well. If you were to bite into an apple and it turns brown, that's polyphenol oxidase happening. And so if you were to take a salad bar, perchance, where you put lettuce out and you spray sulfur on it, it won't brown. And that leads me to the only death that's ever happened in America due to SO2 poisoning is somebody sprayed too much on it and a person ate it and they died from SO2. No one's died from sulfur dioxide poisoning or reaction from wine. And so that leads me to something that's kind of crazy to me, is that we have to label it on wine. But I'll move to that in a second. So why do we continue using wine? Number one, it prevents the browning. Number two, it captures the oxidative compounds that happen in wine as wine ages. And that's why when wines get old, they kind of smell like bruised apples and things like that. If you ever want to smell that compound, it's called acetaldehyde or acetaldehyde, depending on how you want to pronounce it. But if you ever want to smell that, go smell a Fino sherry. It's basically pure acetaldehyde. And the way that we stop that from happening is we use sulfur. So that's what keeps wine from getting old and bad. The other thing we use it for is prevention of microbes. Like I talked about earlier, stops things from it stops microbes from living. And it inhibits their ability to function. Primarily, it works really well on bacteria. It doesn't work very well on yeast. It's not something we should use to inhibit yeast because it's not good at that. Particularly yeast are pretty tough. They can manage sulfur really, really well. But bacteria don't like it a whole lot. It shuts them down. So that leads me to one of the next things is that if we want to prevent bacteria from growing in our wine, we use sulfur. And now the reason why that matters is there's a lot of white wines we don't allow a lot of bacteria to exist in. So most of the fresher, brighter styles of white wine like Sauvignon Blanc, Pinot Gris, things like that, the things that people drink because they don't get red wine headache, they have a lot more sulfur in them. And we're putting a lot more sulfur in those wines intentionally in order to prevent those bacteria from growing. And those bacteria are usually what we call lactic acid bacteria. There's a whole host of them, from Pediococcus damnosus, which is actually probably the worst of them, and it sounds like the worst of them. Then we've got things like lactobacillus, and then we've got Enococcus. And these things all eat lactic acid, or malic acid, which exists in grapes. And we use sulfur to prevent that. And why that matters is most red wine goes through a secondary fermentation called malolactic fermentation. And why that matters to you is that depending on the bacteria, especially Pediococcus is pretty nasty. If there's not a lot of sulfur around and it's allowed to thrive, it can carve up a lot of amino acids that are left in the wine that yeast don't particularly like histidine and tyramine. And it turns it into compounds like histamine and tyrosine. And these two culprits are particularly known for causing all sorts of nasty things to happen. And you've probably heard of histamine because you use antihistamines to be able to exist out in a garden like this. I just get this way by living out here and getting used to it, but y'all do what you need to do. Point being is that if we allow these wines to go through secondary fermentations, they're going to have elevated levels of amines, especially if the pH is particularly high in wines. And so what happens is when we get those high levels of compounds, it causes some vascular reactions. And that's probably the reason that we get red wine headache, is from using less sulfur, not more, less. Right? You got that? So the fact of the matter is the reason we get red wine headache is probably from that, or perhaps other things. I got some hunches about higher alcohols that occur once we get into plus 14% fermentations and other things that are hard to process, but I'll leave that for another time. So we've got history, We've got why we use it in winemaking. And then why do we have to label it on wine and nothing else? Which baffles me. Well, there's an activist group called Mothers Against Drunk Driving in the 1980s, wanted labels slapped on everything. So they put a bunch of money into getting alcohol labeled with machinery things and all that stuff. That's probably okay. You know, realistically, we shouldn't be drinking and driving. And we shouldn't be drinking and driving forklifts. Trust me, I've seen the results of that. But point being, not personally, I've seen the results. Point being is we have to put sulfites on wine, which is odd because sulfites are in a lot of other things. I mean, like a lot. So let's start with a few things that you might know. You ever seen a golden raisin or a dried apricot that's nice and pink? Well, or kind of that golden color? Well, the reason it's not brown is because of sulfur. You know all those dried fruits that are nice and the color of the fruit? That's because they got sulfur. If you don't add it, they turn brown because that polyphenol oxidase takes hold and happens really fast. So if you want really brightly colored things, we add sulfur because it inhibits that polyphenol oxidase. You know what else is it? It's in a ton of? Like, you want to look at cookie dough? Oh my. And it drives me nuts more than anything is grape juice in the store. Like all the grape juices, not all of them, but I'm sure many of them, they add like 500 to 700 parts of sulfur to those grape juices. Now, compared to wine, where wine might have at most, legal limit in America is 350 parts total SO2, these grape juices have 50 to 70% more, and they're selling them without a label. And that drives me kind of bonkers. Like, why is wine strapped with this particular label? And I think that's kind of crazy. So, if you're a person that's really concerned about sulfite, you should be looking at a whole host of different foods that we use this on still that they don't have to use it, don't have to label. So that leads me to the next point is the only time that person died was because of, again, so anyway, let me do one more thing on sulfur. Let me get my head back on straight. So another thing is we use sulfur for is to drive style and flavor in wine. So one of the things that we can do is we can inhibit that secondary fermentation, which keeps wines fresher and brighter. Sometimes we intentionally add so much SO2 to a wine that it creates a flavor profile. So once we get over about 200 parts total SO2 in wine, you start to get a flavor called sulfate. And that's from all the SO2 that's bound to usually aldehyde in wine. And it can create this minerally taste. So a lot of the style of things like German Riesling or Chablis, where we talk about the minerality or minerality, that comes from high levels of sulfur dioxide. The reason that those white wines age really well is because they have a lot of sulfur in it. And I find that absolutely fascinating. Excuse me. We use it to drive style. Now, as a matter of fact, if I'm an American winemaker and I want to import wine into Germany, the legal limit for me to go into Germany is 250 parts total, whereas wines in Germany can have up to 400 parts total because they don't want us to be able to replicate that particular flavor profile that comes in those really sweet, special, like Ausschläses and Trockenbauen Ausschläses that are sweet, that have a lot of sulfur bound up in them, and it creates that flavor profile. So if you are really interested in having lower SO2 wines, drink old red wine. Old red wine has very little, because most of the SO2 in the red wines binds up and drops out. So if you're really, truly concerned about sulfur, if you drink a 10-year-old bottle of red wine, I can guarantee there's little to no sulfur left in it. It's probably gone. Whereas white wine, it doesn't drop out because in red wine, it precipitates out with the phenolics or the tannins, but in white wine, it just stays there. So if you really were to get headaches from sulfur, you wouldn't be drinking white wine. So I'll leave it at that. But the last thing is I do think we need to have an awareness of sulfur and SO2 because it is a real allergen. It does exist. And as a matter of fact, but the odds that wine is going to trigger it is pretty slim to none. I mean, it's possible. Don't get me wrong. There's some people out there, but it's a vanishingly small number that's really allergic to sulfite at the levels that are in wine. Now, however, that person that died that got the salad bar got somewhere around a 7,000 part per million ad. I mean, they got a bolus of it. And I had a woman almost die on me. So in 2002, 2003, so over 20 years ago, we had some damage to our house from a big snowstorm that came through. And I had an insurance adjuster come up, talking to her like I'm talking to you right now. And she's telling me, because I'm a winemaker, she's allergic to sulfites, can't drink wine. And I give her the same rant I gave you just now, that, oh, it's probably not sulfur. She goes, no, really, I am super allergic to it. I've been tested. And I was like, wow, that's really interesting. You're the first person I've ever met that's really allergic to it. And as I'm talking to her, she's looking at me and she's just getting red in the face and she's not looking good. And I'm like, are you doing okay? She's like, no, I'm not. And I'm just looking at her and I just glance out of the corner of my eye because we're standing next to her car. And I look on the front seat of the car and I'm like, did you take that? And she goes, yeah, my joints have been sore. And I'm like, oh my God, get in my car right now. So I threw in my 500 horsepower Lancer Evolution and blasted up to an emergency care place. They got her shot with an EpiPen and, got her back. And that woman didn't have, I mean, by the time I got to the place, she had minutes, like literally minutes left. She was going. She was choked out. She's going down. Barely got her in the place. And the fact of the matter is, I looked down on the front seat and what I saw was glucosamine. Yep, that's right. Glucosamine with chondroitin. Glucosamine sulfate. Well, that woman gave herself the dose of an entire pallet of wine that morning. And so, well, maybe not that much, maybe like 10 cases worth. Anyway, I'm being a little hyperbolic. I do that sometimes. Forgive me. Point being is that if we're really concerned about sulfites and we're really concerned about them, being an issue, why are we worried about it in wine? We don't use a fraction of what the other stuff is. And if I forgot something, let me know in the comments below. Anyway, that was a fun one. Thank y'all and have a wonderful day. Cheers.